Hi there, and thanks everybody for joining the webinar today. Really excited to be together talking about simplifying spend transparency for life sciences companies, really focused on that emerging and mid-sized space. I know we're about a month out from having submitted our US federal reports. Of course, there are some OUS deadlines on the horizon, but figured it was a good time to have a conversation around spend programs, and what we can do to kind of address the challenges that we face and really kind of prep ourselves for a strong 2024 reporting cycle.
Today, what we're going to be doing is our agenda is broken into four main components. First, we're going to be discussing elements of an effective spend transparency program, and then also how to maintain that program. We'll also be discussing common challenges, and then also how to overcome those common challenges as it relates to spend transparency. And then lastly, also discuss how to understand the benefits of leveraging technology to drive transparency and then ultimately accountability for your organization. Moving on to the next slide is we thought we'd be remiss not to also just touch upon some four main updates. I think all of us are aware of this, but just wanted to briefly touch upon what's been going on in the spend world. So first of all, with Connecticut, until 2022, Connecticut was requiring spend transparency reporting for APRNs, so for advanced practice registered nurses. And what ended up happening is due to the federal open payments expansion, the Connecticut law was preempted, so no longer required to be reported. But what ended up happening is this year, so in 2024, Connecticut deployed a new registration and spend transparency reporting obligation. And what they did is they defined who a pharmaceutical sales rep is, and they're requiring that annually by June 30th of every year, a life sciences company is required to report the aggregate number of contacts a pharmaceutical sales rep has with a prescribing practitioner, as well as whether product samples, materials, or gifts of any value were also provided to a prescribing practitioner. So that's the first quick update. The second one also just has to do with just general federal reminders. So I'm sure we were all heads down to meet that March 31st deadline. And so the dispute period will be closing soon on the CMS Open Payments portal on May 15th. And then open payments data will be published on June 30th. Now, the third quick update relates to the ABPI code of 2024 being released. So it will be replacing the 2021 ABPI code. There was a consultation period in which everybody could actually publicly remit particular additions to the code. So that occurred in mid-December of 2023 through the end of February of 2024. And there are a variety of proposed changes that I'm not going to touch upon all of them, but some of them include, for example, the understanding the use of QR codes and then accessing prescriber information from printed materials. So that will be potentially added, as well as also providing clarity on the different arrangements between companies and patient organizations. So that's three. And then the fourth actually relates to enhanced business rules for patient organization reports, which is impacting 36 EU countries. And what's happening there is this is primarily a focus on how health data is being used. So is it being used for primary purposes such as patient treatment or secondary purposes such as research, registries, and healthcare systems management? So this is ultimately trying to just enhance the efficiency and then effectiveness of health data utilization.
And while you're answering the poll and we're waiting for those results to come in, I will jump right into kind of the core elements of an effective spend transparency program. And of course, we're not kind of deep diving into spend transparency itself, but really wanted to kind of level set around what does an effective program require, whether you're emerging, you're just putting your program in place, you're kind of mid-sized or even at large pharma or med device companies, like what are we looking at and how are we kind of thinking about, what does an effective program look like? And what that really boils down to is kind of three key elements, the ability, accuracy, completeness, and efficiency all drive that effectiveness. So when we talk about accuracy, that's really the ability to gather and report data that reflects the true value and nature of those transfers of value that are reportable. The second is completeness, making sure that you're gathering all of the different types of natures of payments, that you're gathering them from all relevant source systems in all applicable jurisdictions across all of your business units, right? And that I think is really where a lot of the complexity, especially for companies that maybe don't have a spend technology solution or dedicated resources, really struggle, is feeling good about the completeness of their reporting. And so a lot of what we'll talk about kind of when we get to the challenges solution section does focus around, how can we tackle and kind of ensure and feel better that we're kind of completely reporting as required. And then the last piece is efficiency, right? So how do we capture and report those transfers of value with the minimum possible burden on business stakeholders to ensure that they can focus on high priority, high risk work, and we're not bogging them down with having them do a bunch of like manual tracking or scrambling at year end, right? So like how do we ensure that we're kind of implementing a program which is sort of self-sustaining, and we're not burdening the business as, I mentioned before, spend is sort of a necessary evil, right? Like it's good data, it's interesting data, but at the end of the day, most people view it as more of a burden than a benefit. And so we really want to make sure that we're approaching it in a way that, is, fit for purpose, where we can meet the requirements, but also aren't being unnecessarily burdensome to the rest of the organization. On the next slide, we talk a little bit about, so how do you maintain a spend program, right? Like what are kind of the key tenets that we want to be thinking about and kind of keeping top of mind as we, again, kind of endeavor down that spend transparency program? I think the first and probably the biggest challenge and kind of thing to consider is resource allocation, right? Like identifying, what is the scope of the program? Where are you required to report? And then what resources are needed to actually meet those requirements? And I'd say across our clients and what we see in the industry is that there's a really broad range of how spend transparency programs are resourced and how they're handled. In some cases, you have dedicated headcount that is responsible for spend. In some cases, that dedicated headcount isn't actually doing a whole lot around spend until, Q1 of the year where, the reports are due, and the rest of the time they have and wear different hats in the organization. So I think really being clear on the resources that are required to be effective is really important. And like Morgan said, later in the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about how you can build a business case to bring technology as one of those critical resources to maintain your program. The next is stakeholder engagement. So I think spend transparency tends to be one of those things that, the business wants nothing to do with. And, whether it sits in compliance or legal or finance, wherever it sits in your organization, people sort of want to wash their hands of it and have it kind of be the sole responsibility of that individual or that, particular business area. That said, you can't really guarantee an effective, efficient compliance spend program without the appropriate involvement cross-functionally. And again, when we get to kind of those specific challenges and solutions, you'll hear a lot about how relying on cross-functional support and even kind of global stakeholders can be a very important part of addressing some of the challenges in complying with spend transparency requirements, especially if you have a global footprint. The next two sort of go hand in hand, right? Phased implementation and continuous improvement. When we think about spend programs, and I mean, all things compliance, truthfully, we want to show and demonstrate that everything we're doing is, our intent is to comply and our intent is to comply fully. And, whenever we identify that there are potential issues or roadblocks, that we're doing something about it and that we are not just sort of turning a blind eye or just pretending that things are fine. So I think a good strategy can be phased implementation, right? Like we're going to talk about a lot of ideas and a lot of things today. And of course, like it'd be great if you could do all of them tomorrow, but that's not the reality. So I think, really thinking about this as kind of a long journey to a spend transparency program, one of those critical things is phased implementation, right? Like picking, sometimes it can be energizing, right? To pick things that are sort of low hanging fruit where it may not be a huge impact, but you kind of gain traction and, made a minor change and it's sort of a domino effect. So you can pick kind of the easy things or low hanging fruit. The other way to think about it is you could pick something that you think will have a big impact and alleviate kind of a bunch of, give you some more time back. But ultimately, it's not realistic to tackle everything all at once. So kind of being realistic and kind of phasing it and really showing that you have a plan for continuous improvement is really important.
So when we were thinking about high-level buckets of challenges that you might face with your spend transparency program, we first thought of governance and buy-in and obtaining governance and obtaining buy-in. So we bucketed this into 5 challenges. Will be another slide as well. And then, of course, solutions to these challenges. So the first challenge is often it can be difficult to navigate the changing landscape of spend transparency reporting requirements. So as we know, there's a variety of laws and then there's a variety of also codes. And so it can sometimes be a little difficult to distinguish between legal requirements established by laws and guidelines set forth by industry codes of conduct. So it's important to be keeping abreast also of the fact that there are constantly new or changing requirements. And then ultimately, right with that, there's no real single source of truth as it relates to spend requirements. So it's really important to recognize, of course, that there are a variety of sources. So having a look at government websites, industry publications, and then also legal documents. And it's all very, very crucial to understand all of these pieces to establish a comprehensive understanding of the obligations related to spend. And so in terms of solutioning there, we think it's really important to review publications from regulatory authorities, especially in jurisdictions where changes are anticipated, and also see what industry associations are publishing. So a great source of that is LinkedIn. A lot of the industry associations are publishing quite frequently if there's an upcoming change or a change that just came into fruition. And then also attending conferences. And I think this also feeds into the second solution we'll talk about, but also leveraging your network as well. And then another challenge we typically see to related to governance and buy-in is also understanding and complying with all the requirements outside of the US. So what we really think is important to do in terms of solutioning here is collaborating and partnering with local resources such as like HR, finance, and then IT teams who are like local on the ground. And that's really leaning on them because they should be able to provide insights into the regulatory requirements abroad and then also nuances related to data collection or reporting processes. We also think it's important to utilize technology as well. So here we're thinking about the potential benefits that can be gleaned from tools such as Google Translate and then AI for language translation services. But we definitely stress the importance too of ensuring that these tools are utilized within your company guidelines and policies, just honestly to ensure data security, and then also checking the accuracy of information that's being shared on some of these AI platforms. And then of course, again, leveraging your professional network. Then Sam too, am I missing anything with these two points?
I would say just kind of like on a very practical perspective, just to like get real with everybody. When I think about like how I kind of manage and keep up with this is going to sound like very simple, but I have like bookmarks galore. And so I have kind of a single source of truth where it shows the jurisdictions and all the relevant websites and where it gets submitted. And then all of those are bookmarked. Because especially when you're looking at a global program and global footprints, it's just not realistic for anybody, even if you're doing it day in and day out, to remember the nuances of everything, especially kind of given the challenge of the code versus law and like how that comes into play as well. So sometimes the simple solutions do make your life easier. So think about how you can maybe keep a tracker of the resources that you rely on, or the email, listservs that you're a part of. So I find that those types of like easy solutions do actually make your life a little better and a little simpler when it comes to kind of managing and complying. And the other thing I would say, and I know Morgan talked a little bit about kind of like some of the local nuances and especially local language challenges. And I think especially in places like, France, South Korea, where, it's almost impossible to find resources in English. It's really important where you can to partner with those local individuals. And even if they aren't compliance, right, they typically can and are willing to help kind of with translations or getting you access to like portals where needed, because in some cases you have to be in country to be able to access them. So it's not always about asking them to do the work, right? Like how else can you partner with them? Even if it's like, hey, I did this Google Translate of the law, like, can you just do a quick gut check and make sure that it makes sense to you? And then the other thing I would add is when you really need it, there are also translation services, which we do leverage as well, that are kind of more versed in like business translations, where sometimes Google Translate and the AI is more used to kind of conversational translations that can also be really helpful. So sometimes, again, like those simple solutions are the ones that we kind of overlook and we should be leveraging.
Thanks, Sam. So another challenge too is also managing manual processes and then also just ensuring consistency year over year. And so some ways to solution for that is to maintain a governance document such as the playbook. So really having a playbook that includes your entire spend inventory, and then also programmatic level trackers such as keeping track of all your in-scope jurisdictions, and then also due dates, as well as flagging upcoming due dates. And then it's also really important to gather and store all data in a central repository, just so everything is located and housed in one place. So we find that SharePoint's helpful, Teams is helpful, as well as Dropbox. And then also as it relates to keeping track of critical tasks, so there we're thinking perhaps of using some sort of project management software such as Smartsheet or even Teams planner apps can be quite helpful and just make this entire process more seamless. And then also, and I think what's really important is really establishing good data retention habits. So storing original and transformed files for all data sources for auditability, and then also maintaining all emails that might be going back and forth between business stakeholders, and then also retaining copies of all spend submissions that are submitted as well.
I think the one thing I would add here, and this is what I honestly, like I tell my team, and they probably laugh if they were listening to this webinar, is I always think like, what does future me want to see when I come back and pick this up, right? Like I think in the moment, especially when we're rushing towards federal deadlines and just kind of trying to get through the necessary kind of steps, we forget to help our future selves. So I always kind of think, at the conclusion of a reporting, I go through my emails, I drop in, critical decisions and, any back and forth that might be helpful for me in the future to avoid, getting rid of it through email, accidentally losing it in email retention. And then also like really thinking about, a year from now, am I going to remember why I included this or excluded this, why I had this file or where it came from? And so I always make it a habit of adding an extra tab to every Excel file that just literally has kind of some of that high level information. So I always think like, what would future me want to see when I open this file up a year from now? And I know, again, it's kind of silly and simple, but I think we forget that, especially as we're kind of have, competing priorities and we're rushing to do other things, but taking that extra, 30 minutes to close out a reporting period with those types of things really helps set you up to be a little more efficient and less crazed kind of year over year. And then to Morgan's point about the playbook, right? I think, everybody probably has policies, kind of some kind of SOP, if you will, that's high level. But when we say playbook, I mean like a long document where like every time you call the CMS help desk or every time you kind of make a decision on like where you're getting reporting from or why you're doing something, like it's really sort of a work instruction like manual that is just for kind of the spend transparency head counts that again make it so much easier, especially if you're trying to train somebody else or there's been transitions in the organization. So think of that playbook very much as detailed work instructions. And again, like what would you want to see to be able to hand it over to somebody and just kind of hit the ground running? I feel like when it comes to process and documentation, I feel like it's worth its weight in gold, the time you spend, laying out those types of things.
All right. So the next challenge we wanted to discuss too, again, under governance and buy-in, has to relate to ensuring roles and responsibilities are clearly defined and then also understood across the organization. So here, it's really important to have a roles and responsibilities document that can establish like accountability and essentially designate teams or individuals who are responsible for reviewing and then also approving final reports before submission. And then not only that, but also defining who is going to handle escalations, how are resolutions to disputes going to be handled, and then really documenting all that information to streamline the decision-making process at your organization. It's also really important too, when we're thinking abroad as well, to establish clear responsibilities at both the global and local level, just to ensure alignment with both overarching company goals and then also local regional regulations as well. And then, of course, again, documenting this information so it's easily accessible, sort of thinking ahead to future you if you needed to pull up different people's roles and then their respective responsibilities. The last challenge too here is also managing and documenting changes to prior year data. So here what we're thinking about is assessing previously unreported data, disputes, and then changes. And it's really important here to establish a systematic process to handle changes or disputes, and then also use a system such as, it could be as simple as an Excel file or a database to track the status of these disputes, as well as thoroughly documenting, I think this is really important, the reasons for any adjustments that are being made, and then who were the individuals involved in this as well. And Sam, am I missing anything?
No, I think just kind of the theme of this section, as you've heard, is really like kind of helping your future self. I feel like documentation, like document, whether it's formal or informal, really does help you. And I will say on the roles and responsibilities front, I think that does make everybody's life a little easier, because I think kind of calling back to the polling results, we were talking about, establishing cross-functional teams. And a lot of people actually put that as kind of their number one in terms of strategy for strong compliant or strong spend programs. And I think, that roles and responsibilities and documenting that cross-functional team kind of go hand in hand, right? Like who's ultimately responsible for kind of signing off on things, who is responsible kind of at the business level for, maybe doing like sub-certifications or other types of things to make sure that the data looks good and complete. And so I think being really clear on who is doing what with respect to the program and, where you need local resources or translation resources or whatever it is, just gets rid of kind of unnecessary confusion and makes it a little easier to kind of operate where everybody knows exactly what they should be doing and kind of where they fall in the overall program.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I think that we have our polling question number 3, and that's surrounding what measures has your company taken to address challenges with the spend transparency reporting process? With that, I'll pass it to Sam.
Awesome. So these next 2 slides are really focused on identifying or challenges with identifying reportable spend. So kind of thinking about that completeness piece. And if I'm thinking about what keeps me up at night, I think this is the piece for me that I find to be the most challenging. And I'd say every client I've worked with when I was in house, this tends to be the thing that everybody struggles with, no matter how big or small you are. Like, how do you feel good that you have eyes on everything that, is going on in your company and organization that may result in reportable transactions? So I think the first is, how are you ensuring that, you're identifying and leveraging the relevant systems where they exist that capture data to support the spend program? The first thing I always think about is, what non-traditional data sources can you use to enrich kind of those typical ones, right? So when we think about typical spend, I'm sure we're all thinking about travel and expense, our customer relationship management software, our ERP system, right? Like, those are all kind of the obvious ones. But then where else can you kind of turn to one, enrich those original source data systems, but also like validate that you're not missing anything, like reprints, for example. So kind of thinking outside the box, looking at, what other data can your CRM give you, right? Like, can you gain anything in terms of like your rep rosters or territories that helps you kind of feel good that in the US that you have all of your reps kind of registered and doing reporting at the state level where they're calling, right? So like, how can you leverage your CRM to kind of tie into that state level reporting requirement? If you have it, most companies, even kind of in early stages, tend to have kind of a grant or external funding software system. And even if compliance or finance, whoever's doing spending organization, doesn't have access to it kind of as part of its original workflow, it can be a great data source to say, okay, even though I have my ERP and I have a GL that is dedicated to grants, like, can I cross-check that with my grant system, for example, or whatever maybe manual process exists for those looking at the grants? So like, where can I identify those additional data sources to kind of cross-reference between kind of your typical spend sources with some of these more unique ones? Other kind of non-traditional things we think about are, your sampling vendors or your kind of rep credentialing vendors can also be helpful. So as a compliance person myself, I typically, like, when I join meetings, I'm sort of, even though the meeting might be on topic A, like, I'm trying to gain all the information I can. And if somebody mentions a system that I'm not aware of or a process I'm not aware of, like, your first thought should be like, can I use that for spend? Like, can I use that to augment? And we've done other presentations on data-driven compliance programs, and that's kind of ties into that as well, right? Like, we always want to kind of be aware of those systems and get creative in how you can use them in your spend program specifically. And that second bullet is kind of saying that, right? So how do we stay up to date on technology initiatives across the organization? Who can you connect with in terms of, is it somebody in IT? Is it somebody in the business where, they kind of are a friend of compliance, right? And they'll loop you in and say, hey, like, not sure if you've heard that we're, trying to implement an HCP engagement software, or we're trying to, implement a grants management system, right? Like, find those friends in the organization so compliance can be a part of the conversation. Because as I'm sure we're all aware and have experienced, most of them can benefit spend transparency, but if you're not thinking about spend on the front end or when they're being implemented, it can kind of limit the long-term usefulness or how easy it is to get data out of the system. The point being, when it comes to relevant systems, think beyond those traditional ones that we are commonly using, and also figure out who you can find in the organization as a friend that can keep you abreast of the new changes and tech that's coming. The second big challenge is identifying vendors that may be making reportable transfers of value. I would say, those that are making, those that are directly covered recipients, like in the US, your HCPs, your physicians, sorry, I just said the same thing twice. But your APRNs and that type of stuff, typically they're a little easier to spot in big data sources. I'd say we tend to see struggles with kind of indirect vendors, those marketing agencies, CROs, staffing agencies, other places where, it may not be as clear and there's still a potential that they're working with or making transfers of value to, covered recipients. So to that end, we talk a lot about augmenting the vendor onboarding process. So what can you do to kind of embed yourself or embed compliance and spend considerations into vendor onboarding? That can be as easy as asking a couple of yes/no questions in that vendor onboarding form. Most companies have some kind of vendor onboarding process, whether that's formal or informal, where they're gathering things like their billing information and contact information. And so it can be as easy as adding a couple of questions to that form where you're saying, are you a healthcare provider? Are you owned by a healthcare provider? Are you going to be working with healthcare providers on behalf of the organization? It can be a really easy way to capture vendors, which may be otherwise hard to identify, where there could be, especially indirect spend. And again, if you can't necessarily capture that information in your vendor master software or your ERP, an offline spreadsheet, I know it's kind of not very fancy, but capturing it and kind of embedding your process where your vendor onboarding is sending that form to compliance, you're manually maintaining a list of those vendors who may have indirect spend. That little bit of time and investment on the front end does help you kind of capture those reportable or potentially reportable vendors, like when you go through those big data sets like your ERP or accounts payable data. The other thing that kind of we talk a lot about in this bucket, if you will, is around how can you enhance the general ledger and how payments are being coded to, again, capture potentially reportable spend. So when I'm thinking about spend and I'm kind of assessing where spend might be, specifically in an enterprise resource context, like an SAP, I think about it in two dimensions. One dimension is, do I have a way to kind of filter down to reportable vendors? And then lens B is, do I have a way to narrow it down by general ledger account? So if you don't already have it in your system or built this way, it can be very helpful to have HCP specific or covered recipient specific codes, like for consulting, meals and lodging, and things like that. That again can help you kind of narrow your focus when you're getting potentially large data sets or sort of unmanageable data sets, and kind of narrowing your focus on what you really need to dig into. The last kind of piece on this slide is around research-related spend. So I would say, especially for early stage or kind of, early companies, research is probably one of the bigger spend sources. And again, compliance isn't always embedded in that. So how do you feel comfortable that you're capturing all of the clinical research, that you kind of have all of the both direct and indirect data sources? And again, this is a place where it's really critical to partner with your ClinOps team or whoever it is who's kind of responsible for clinical trials. Oftentimes they have software managing that. So how can you pull reports or, other kind of pieces of information that help you feel good that you've captured all kind of in scope clinical trials? So really partnering with, again, that kind of key business stakeholder. And a lot of times what we see people do with research-related spend is at the end of spend reporting, especially in the US, they'll take their clinical or their research data and just do a simple pivot by study name or by study number and say, okay, we have, $300,000 for study X, and they reach out to ClinOps and say, does that make sense? Is that kind of in line with what you would expect from a budget? And so again, some of those simple gut checks and leveraging those business stakeholders can be really helpful in feeling good that you're not missing big chunks of spend. On the next slide, just a couple of more challenges with identifying spend. So how do you feel good that if you know all of your source systems and you have this GL vendor process in place, that you still aren't missing things, that you're kind of, things aren't slipping through the cracks, or, how are you feeling good? This is the part where I typically look and kind of recommend sort of a three-way check where possible, right? You have your kind of vendor list, you have your GL list, you've done sort of your manual review and filter and kind of gut check. And then the third piece is, where can you implement additional tracking mechanisms or kind of tie into existing tracking mechanisms as sort of a gut check, or not a gut check, but like a final kind of cross check, if you will. So a good example is, let's say, sponsorships or donations, right? So if you have a sponsorships, donations, GL, whoever is approving those or kind of processing them, like it might be worthwhile to say, hey, I would love it if you could keep sort of an informal, simplified Excel sheet that shows me like what donations you've looked at, if you've approved, like what's been approved, the payment amount, and if it related to a healthcare provider or covered recipient, right? And we're not asking them to do like crazy levels of tracking or filling out, the US spreadsheet that has 100 columns in it, but even just asking them to kind of keep some simplified tracking can be a really smart way to feel good that you've collected all of the data. The next slide, or the next piece here, is on kind of capturing those ad hoc or infrequent spend types. So kind of what comes to mind for me here are things like mergers and acquisitions, physician ownership. Bad debt tends to be one that gets forgotten, especially in the US. Again, partnering with those stakeholders and making sure that, you know, you have a regular cadence to check in. So if it's legal, or you have kind of an acquisitions team who's responsible for mergers and acquisitions, you know, just put a reminder on your calendar that, you know, January 1st of every year, you're going to reach out and say, hey, did anything happen that compliance might not be aware of that I should report? On the physician ownership front, this really applies to companies that don't have, that aren't public companies. And so oftentimes in this respect, you can send out sort of shareholder like certifications as part of other year-end processes that you're just simply asking them if there is physician ownership, or they have that kind of familial relationship that's reportable in the US. So it's all about, you know, when I think about kind of full compliance spend programs, it's running through all the natures of payments, both in the US and OUS where you're reporting, and almost having kind of a list to say like, well, how do I feel good? And like, what's sort of my cross check or my process to gather that information? And again, that kind of goes all the way back to governance at the start of the presentation. And then the other thing is just making sure just driving general awareness. So obviously, you know, training is kind of the easy one, but then also just-in-time communications can be really helpful around critical deadlines, right? So reaching out to, you know, your marketing team to say, hey, you know, I know it's year end and I have this kind of list of, you know, indirect spend where you've run, you know, you have these agencies that you're working with, healthcare providers. Did you miss anything? Did you forget to send compliance something that you should have sent them? So those, don't underestimate the value of kind of just-in-time communications around those critical deadlines. And then we can move to the next slide. So the last bucket of challenges is around data completeness and reporting. And again, I feel like this is one of those ones that is very frustrating as a compliance, finance, or anybody doing spend. Is you have the data sources, you have the information, but then you're going to complete your US spend template, for example, and you don't have the information you need, right? You don't have the healthcare provider's address or their license number or whatever it is. I know, again, this probably seems like an obvious solution, but leverage publicly available data sets wherever you can. You know, NPES, the VPL, state licensing boards can be really helpful. And again, you know, when you find those sources that are helpful, making sure you're flagging them in your browser to make it easy to find them again and again. And then the other piece is leveraging internal data sets. So even in the smallest of companies, it's typical to have a customer relationship management software that is hooked to something like a OneKey or a MedPro connector that has that kind of rich healthcare provider data. Sometimes that data is limited OUS, but again, if it's not already embedded or something that compliance has access to kind of directly, just asking for a login and asking for kind of direct access to those data sets can make your life much easier as you're trying to, you know, address missing taxonomy. And then we often use tech on kind of simple solutions, right? Like index matches, VLOOKUPs, fuzzy matching to match information across data sets. So kind of blending into the next where we're talking about other miscellaneous missing data, you know, one thing that we often do is, you know, in a company where you have multiple products and you maybe don't have that product information available in the data set itself to say, oh, this transaction was related to product XYZ. If you have other components of information, like a good example is if you know the rep who made that spend, and you can use your CRM data to say, oh, rep XYZ is you know, specific to this product, then you can use that kind of CRM or that territory or BU level data to then kind of merge it together and kind of enrich and, you know, fill in gaps where possible. Not ideal, but sometimes you do just have to make reasonable assumptions and, again, document those assumptions. So I think, you know, one of the most important things is making sure that we're being reasonable and that we're really like showing our intent to comply with the regulations. So in cases where you maybe don't have, dates or like kind of the same approach to dates that you use elsewhere, or you have issues where people aren't using your healthcare provider lookups in your expense system, right? Just document what you've done to try to supplement that data, enrich that data, make it what it needs to be, and show that you have a plan to address those gaps. And then lastly, how do you prepare, and submit reports without a spend solution? So I think, the obvious answer is, right, you're just using the templates and the Excel and the data that you have to prepare the reports. But then also, again, it's kind of a final gut check and make sure everybody's kind of on the same page, do some sub-certifications with those business stakeholders to kind of do a final quality check before you are submitting the reports. And then the other thing is in Excel, you can build in validation rules and, flag for duplicates and, limit certain things to like date formats and all of that. And again, like I know it's really simple, but when you don't have a spend solution that can't spit out a nice formatted report for you, those things, year over year can make your life easier and a little less stressful.
So what we were doing when thinking through building a business case for a spend transparency technology solution is we actually bucketed this into 4 overarching buckets. First is risk, and then resources, insights, and governance. And diving into risk, what is important to think about is the spend program scope and complexity for your organization. So, for example, are you a complex spend structure, meaning you're working with multiple vendors across many jurisdictions? Or do you have high levels of volumes of transactions where making manual tracking and analysis might be impractical or require too many personnel, for example? Whereas the alternative of that might be that you have a more simplified spend structure. So you might be working with just fewer vendors and jurisdictions, and you have low transaction volumes. So therefore, there might not be a need for a specialized technology. So those are definitely things to consider as it relates to risk. Are you also thinking about anything also, Sam, to add to that?
I would say the one thing here too is think about growth. So when you're kind of making the business case, I think a lot of times what we see in those kind of small emerging companies is people are like, oh, spend's not a big deal. We don't have a lot of transactions, which is oftentimes true kind of when you're heading into it. And so the priority at that point is setting up your systems in a way that you can extract spend data, right? That you're capturing kind of and have the fields you need. But setting up a technology solution kind of before you head into that growth curve can ensure that while you're kind of growing, that you already have these resources in place. So also think about like, even if in your year 2 of spend, like, can you demonstrate that year 1 versus year 2 got exponentially more complex or had X many more line items or cost you X many more hours of time? So think about quantifying it in that respect as well, because that can be very impactful when you're trying to make the case for a technology solution, is showing kind of year over year trajectory of the complexity and where the program is going.
And I think too, when you think about resources, I think we can all agree that spend can be a very necessary, but also time-consuming activity. And so it's important when thinking about whether to introduce a solution or not, to think about the amount of time spent by resources. So for example, if there's a resource or multiple resources that expend, say, 100 hours, then maybe it might make sense to free up that time through a solution. So it's really important to quantify time spent on compliance activities here. And then also think about how a spend solution can focus on risk-based decisions rather than solely just compliance tasks that could benefit your organization as a whole. Is there anything else come to mind for you?
I think the one thing, I think Morgan said it very diplomatically, but I think with the resources, right, like we all know compliance and finance typically have kind of finite resources, right, both in terms of people and hours. That said, there's always a trade-off between like what your people are focusing on. So can you demonstrate to say like, yes, spend is a necessary evil. It costs us 100 hours, but if you give me a spend solution, it's going to cost me X amount. And I'm going to get to allocate those 100 hours of headcount to something else that's much higher risk and maybe more valuable to the business or more critical to kind of your continued growth or your business strategy. So kind of in thinking about building the business case, how can you show that there is a very clear trade-off between time spent on spend, whether it's hours or dollars, and the ability for compliance to focus and kind of enable the business in other, sometimes more meaningful ways. So I think when we think about building a business case, like really making that direct correlation to say, like, if we're doing spend, we can't be doing other things, and it's probably worth the X amount of investment in a tech solution.
Mm-hmm. And then also it's important to you to think about insights that can be gleaned from your spend transparency program. So often an organization is using a variety of different data systems, so several types of perhaps expense systems or CRM systems, and often a solution actually can provide really rich data and built-in dashboards that allow you to easily assess your data from all of these various systems and also reduce your reliance on, say, Excel or Tableau. So it's really important to think about whether the benefits that could be gleaned from a solution, perhaps faster than we could all do it manually, is beneficial to think about as it relates to a spend solution. And then go ahead, Sam. Sorry.
No, that's okay. And I would say, like, on the insights front, like, the spend data is very rich. I think people don't, especially in the business, don't always realize that, right? Because you're thinking about, and you can look at your competitors, right? You see like what products are they talking about or kind of being reimbursed for, like what types of expenses are there? And it can be very rich from even a business perspective. So like when we talk about making friends in the business, like this is probably one of the places when you're trying to build a case, like can you find somebody in the organization, if that's commercial or elsewhere, to say like, hey, if I get this solution, I have these dashboards that then you can leverage in a compliant way. And sometimes that can also go a long way in getting budget to do these types of things.
Then lastly, with governance, it's important to think about how a spend technology solution could enhance program governance. And it's important to ask yourself, like, how often are you having to amend and revise prior year reports? And that's something that's certainly important to consider is related to that from the previous year. And then also, what are you doing to investigate the frequency and root causes of data management issues? Because a solution could also be helping to build a business case for avoiding repeat issues. I think it's clear that the government, of course, doesn't look favorably on organizations knowing there's an issue, but not doing anything about it. So a solution could certainly help identify these issues and also streamline that process there.
And I think, again, like nobody wants to highlight when they've done things wrong or when there have been issues, but I will say, this is one of those things that if you've had internal audit come in, or if you haven't, you want to say like, hey, internal audit, want to come take a peek at spend and kind of kick the tires and see how it's going. Like when findings come out of those types of things, or you have had repeat instances where you're missing a subset of data, or you miss reporting and you're kind of continually amending those reports, it really can help build the business case for a tech solution where everything is kind of single source of truth, auditable, and really shows kind of your intent to comply and continued improvements of the program. So when we think about, assume that we've talked about building a business case and you still don't have the buy-in that you need, what else can you kind of lean on, and like, why is spend important? First and foremost, there are penalties, right? There was a settlement with Medtronic not too long ago, and it was the first of its kind where they did use spend transparency data in the US to assess additional fines and penalties because they weren't reporting some of the transactions that resulted or that were related to kind of a broader investigation. It was a very limited number of transactions that were missing, which was very interesting, but they still faced, pretty significant penalties in that respect. So it is something that is very real, and we know the government is starting to really dig into this data. There's also a chance for reputational damage. And when I say reputational damage, this really comes in, and like as compliance, finance people who run spend, we all know that this is public data that everybody can see. But if you don't feel good about your spend program, you don't have strong controls in place, and you're misreporting data, right? Like your customers, your healthcare providers, the patient advocacy organizations you're working with, all see that data. And if it's wrong, that can create, lasting damage to those relationships. So I think really that does tend to resonate with business around why spend is important. And similarly, the kind of the competitive disadvantage, right? Like if you're not doing something or doing something well that you should be doing, that can create, a disadvantage because it looks like you don't want to be kind of a fair player in the, in the industry, right? The other piece is operational inefficiencies, which we've talked a lot about, right? Like poorly designed or poorly executed spend programs tend to take a lot of compliance resources. They tend to take a lot of, head count and kind of lots of cross-checking and lots of kind of chasing and all of that. So it does cost not dollars necessarily if you don't have a tech solution, but it does cost in terms of hours and head count that could be spent elsewhere. And then the last kind of relates to kind of your reputational damage, competitive disadvantage. Like there can be damage to investor confidence, again, because if you're not complying or can't comply with something that's required of the industry, then that can be problematic.